So first, I just want to thank you very much for joining me today. I really appreciate you being here.
I am so happy to be here. Thank you for making me a guest of honor. You were my first ever guest of honor invitation, and I accepted it like as fast as my finger could move toward the yes button.
That's so awesome. I'm really happy that we can do that for you because we were stoked that you said yes. Um, so first, can you introduce yourself to our audience a bit?
Absolutely. My name is Carlos Beto Pablo Hernandez. Carlos Hernandez, and everyone calls me Carlos. And I am a writer. I have been writing for a very long time, and only recently been getting sort of like published in the way that people might care. you know like you work so hard for so long, and you publish in increasingly better paying markets, and you kind of build it up. But my story is very much like that, where my first collection is called The Assimilated Cuban's Guide to Quantum Santeria, and it's a collection of short stories that I'd written over about the past 10 years or so, with a couple of originals in there as well. And that was basically the work of that time, just trying to get published, and trying to get going from that collection. Rick Riordan happened to pick it up, liked it, and then asked me if I was interested in writing middle grade. And at that point, I was like, well, I am now Rick Riordan, famous person. Holy crow. So yeah, I became suddenly interested in middle grade, did a lot of homework, a lot of reading, and then wrote Sal and Gabi Break the Universe, part of the Rick Riordan Presents series. It won the Buddha Belpré Award, which I didn't even know it was being considered for. This is, one of the great honors that the American Library Association, in conjunction with Reforma and the ALSC, offers. It's the same people who do the Newbery Awards. Like they're all kind of like a package there, and it's just winning that is just stunning. It's just unbelievable. So I wrote Sal and Gabi Break the Universe this year in May. The sequel, the last part, because it's a duology, Sal and Gabi Fix the Universe, came out, and spoiler alert, they just break it some more. uh, so yeah, and now I've got like a bunch of other projects and stuff I'm working on. I'm also a college professor. I'm tenured at the City University of New York. I work at BMCC in the Graduate Center there, and I also play a lot of games, and am designing one. I just had a very exciting conversation with a publisher today about a role playing game that I'm working on with my wife, writer C.S.E. Cooney. We are collaborating together to make a game that is very friendly to new players. And the way that we've been talking about it is Fiasco meets Mysterium, if that is going to be enticing to some people out there.
Oh, that's so cool.
I think, as I was growing up, I was reading a lot of science fiction and fantasy, but also reading above my grade level because I had a big sister who was a big reader. And, basically stealing big sister's books was like a thing to do. So I did try to read War and Peace when I was 11. And what I can say about it is I don't really remember the plot, but I remember startling bright images of things. So, like, to this day, I can recall that there's a scene somewhere, I think in maybe like the first third of the book, where there is a Russian soldier outside of a window, upside down, drinking a bottle of vodka. And I remember this extremely vividly in my childhood, going, "Whoa." And I have a couple of those images from that. I read a lot of Piers Anthony now, and this was before I kind of knew what kind of person Pierce Anthony ended up being, and maybe wouldn't necessarily have allowed myself to read it had I been my own father, which I've tried to do a few times, but doesn't work out. No, but I read a lot of fantasy and science fiction growing up. Loved Lord of the Rings growing up, and I also was reading a lot of classics. And so I think I had a big various mix. What I didn't have a lot of is Latinx fiction. I think, as I kind of like think back, the absolute burgeoning of literature by people of color that is happening now, and allowing people to kind of see themselves in all, from all different walks of life and all different vantages, that just didn't exist. And so I do often think about how different my life might have been if I had been able to read things that were more from cultures that I recognized, as opposed to dominant culture. But I also, became an English major in college and got a PhD in English, and so I was pretty committed to all of this literature that I was reading. And then, the farther I went to graduate school, the more I was able to read much more Latinx fiction and world fiction as well, just and a lot more variety. And so that's where I really feel like, my reading was not so much governed by the standards that are of dominant culture, but that's where I kind of really learned to be a writer.
Oh, do you remember your first experience with like Latinx literature of some kind? Do you remember what that would be?
I think what it would have been is a book called Bless Me Ultima by Rodolfo Anaya. And it was absolutely this, thunderbolt of realization that, oh, my culture can absolutely be represented, And so it's the story basically of a boy. It's a Mexican American story. So it's not Cuban American, but
Right.
there were enough recognizable markers there that really made me feel like, oh, I know this in a way that is really true to my life, and it really has to do with this idea of magical realism. Magical realism has become very diluted in our vocabulary now, and people use it to mean sort of like realism but magical, and not really thinking about the socio-political parts where it comes from, how it really is rooted in Latin American experience and in a very particular political kind of conversation. But uh, in that book, you could see it exactly, because Bless Me Ultima, highly political about the Mexican American experience, but also full of. It was my first encounter of seeing a magical abuela, and everybody has a magical abuela. Like if you are Latin American, you will recognize that. Like if you actually don't have a magical abuela of your own, you've seen what magical abuelas in action. This is something that will be very recognizable to you, and then seeing it in literature is like, oh, that's something we can talk about. Oh, well, that's great. And so now, again, the magical abuela has become a little bit of a cliche, and something maybe that we can be adding different kinds of characters now. But when I encountered the abuela in Bless Me Ultima, it was absolutely formative, because I think about Garcia Marquez when he read Kafka, and he was like, oh, you can do that. See, this is where magical realism actually comes from. Magical realism comes from uh, Garcia Marquez reading Kafka and realizing he can unfetter himself and allow his imagination in. But then what he does, because he's also a journalist, is he combines that unfettering of imagination with pinpoint accuracy of place and time and character. And this is then the burgeoning of what we now call magical realism. So to me, that's like, it's really important to know that, that the way that these experiences that are described as magical realism come from, they're not fantasy inventions. They are realism described as accurately as possible, even though they defy our understanding of physics. Like, that's more how I would describe it, and it has to do with the way in which Spanish forms, our Spanish mind. Basically, the way that the words work and the way our idioms work. The example I often use is when we say it's raining cats and dogs, we don't mean that cats and dogs are falling from the sky. It is an idiomatic way of metaphorically explaining something. But nobody believes that cats and dogs are falling from the sky. In Spanish, there is a different way to occupy that space that feels, it's not that you take it literally, but it's also not that you don't take it unliterally as well. You kind of occupy the metaphoric landscape as if it's more real than the way that I think of in English. So, like, two different concepts, one expressed in English, one expressed in Spanish, using metaphoric language. I could feel myself feeling closer to the Spanish one, as if it were more substantive and real, even though both I understand as metaphoric.
Interesting. How many books have you published?
So I published with a friend of mine, David Schneiderman, a book that I think sold 5 copies called Abecedarium. but it's very William Burroughs. It's very much like wild word salad, kind of thing that would really only be of interest to a niche audience. And then I focused on writing short stories, mostly in a science fictional bent, a little bit of fantasy, a little bit of magical realism. And, I published something like 30 stories. And, you start with sort of like free markets, and then you move to uh, markets that pay just like a token payment, and then semi-pro, and then pro, and of course you're weaving in and out of these things. But
Mhm.
but I was slowly trying to build my byline and basically join the community more. Uh, After I published a short story with Rosarium. Basically, they wanted to do a reprint of one of my stories. Bill Campbell, who runs Rosarium, said, "Hey, you ever think about putting a short story collection together?" And I said, "I'm thinking about it now." You notice the theme, right? Like, and this is like a big thing. I had a professor when I was in graduate school, and they met Milton Kessler. He was a poetry teacher, fabulous, fabulous teacher. And one of the things that he said is, put your work out there. Give it a home, whatever it is. Wherever you are, give your work a home, because you never know what it's going to turn into. And it was the best advice I'd ever gotten from any single sentence in a creative writing class. That was the best, because that's how I got my book of short stories published. It's extremely hard to get a book of short stories published, and this is the way that we found it. Just putting work out there, letting people reprint, being in the conversation. So I guess total books is four. Abecedarium, The Assimilated Cubit's Guide to Quantum Santeria, Sal and Gabi Break the Universe, Sal and Gabi Fix the Universe. More to
Cool.
come.
What was it like? How was putting together a book of short stories different as far as like publishing and working with the publishing industry than putting out a book like Sal and Gabby that's like one full volume?
So very different in a number of ways. First of all, I was working with a small publisher, and when you're working with a small publisher, as an author, you get a lot more say. So I got to work with Bill in terms of like the order of things. We had to have one or two original pieces, so it was like, which ones are we going to feature, put out there, and there were things that you had to think about strategically. But I got to work on the book cover intimately, with the artist and with Bill, and I think it turned out great. I think we have a really great book cover on Assimilated. Uh, and I got to have a little bit of feedback with Disney as well. Disney Hyperion published Break and Fix, and they definitely wanted my advice, and I was able to give notes and things like that. But they were going to make that decision, and
Right.
they did a lot of winnowing and weaning before I got to see any art, and the final decision was going to be theirs contractually. So,
Mhm.
the difference, just in terms of any book between a small publisher and a large publisher, really has to do with how much control you have, and the smaller the publisher, the more the control. And what you hope for is the bigger publishers will reward you monetarily and with marketing and other things that smaller presses might not be able to help you with as much. In terms of the short story, though, one of the good things was, because we were collecting short stories, many of them were sort of like camera ready. We did do more copy editing, but a lot of the stories were basically ready to go, and so that meant that they had gone through a lot of the editing process, and so that made the publication cycle much shorter. And with Break and Fix, you're doing multiple revisions, and I am very much a pantser, not a planner. So I'm writing a lot of words. I mean, tens of thousands of words that don't make it into the final draft there. The good news there, though, is working with Stephanie Lurie. I basically have an editor whose job is to be an editor. Stephanie does a lot of other things as well, because these days you have to, but was her job is editing, and she is an incredible editor. I've learned so much about language and writing and structure from the edits that she's given me on these two books. So the other thing I would say is, it, I don't know what it would have been like to publish a novel with a small press, where they wouldn't necessarily have had somebody who could have really honed down on the editing. And of course, that's going to vary from house to house as well. But because it was short stories that were already published, that part didn't come into play as much. But I can tell you that I am, I basically need to like buy Stephanie a car or something. Like, she's so great. She did so much work on my man. Like, I need to buy her I don't know what's like. I need to buy her like a field of saffron, so that basically she will never ever want for money again, So like, people could just go and pick their little saffron and pay, $20 for an ounce or whatever it is, ridiculous for saffron. It's just she is so great and has helped my writing so much and has helped make these books what they are that it's hard to want to go back to not having Stephanie. It's hard to want to have more control because basically I want to collaborate with people about my writing to make it better. I do. I think one of the hardest things about writing when you're learning the industry and things like that is really learning how to take criticism. But I think if you are honest and persistent, you will learn that it's very hard to live without at some point. That that criticism is so enriching, and that you simply don't know the things you don't know, and that's what another mind can bring to you.
How many books did you write before you got an agent?
Well, I guess the answer is two, because Abecedarium and Assimilated both came without an agent. But so the way the story goes is that uh, Stephanie Lurie, the editor I was just talking about, contacted me on Twitter of all places. Everybody have a Twitter account. Keep your mentions open. Just block people you don't like, but keep your mentions open. This is how she contacted me, and she told me Rick had read my book. I mean, I actually knew that because Rick very kindly did like a 5-star review on Goodreads that really helped elevate its profile beforehand. But she said, now I've read Assimilated. How about I take you out for a Cobb salad in Bryant Park, and we talk about the possibility of a middle grade book, and so of course I say yes. Of course, we have this meal. I come, prepared. And so Sal and Gabi are both characters as adults in Assimilated Cubans Guide in different stories. So my concept was, what if I put them in the same middle school in Miami and had this multiverse concept? She loved it. She asked for a write-up. So I had to submit 20,000 words to her, no agent yet, 20,000 words to her, and a 2-page outline, basically, just a 2-page brief outline of what's going to happen in the story. She helped me workshop all of those things. And then it went all the way through every part of Disney, all the approval process. So it had to go through the editorial board. It had to go through the marketing board. Rick Riordan himself had to approve it. And so everybody had to sign off on it. That was not a guarantee. It could have been I wrote 20,000 words for nothing, but I got very lucky and had very good editing from Stephanie, good guidance, and I got it. Then I got the Disney contract, and let me tell you, you think Cthulhu is scary? I dare you to open. I dare you to open a Disney contract. Like, it is about as intimidated as I've ever been in my entire life. Clearly I need an agent, like instantly. Like I need an agent like right now. So I'm very lucky in my life. My brilliant, beautiful wife, Claire Cooney, introduced me to my now very close friend, Amal Elmotar, who you might know from This Is How You Lose the Time War, which has won every award. So she's one of the 2 writers on This Is How You Lose the Time War. I call Amal and I say, people, I know no one. I need an agent like instantly. Can you recommend someone? And she says, I recommend my fabulous, great agent, Dong Wong Song. And so she makes the arrangement so that we can talk to each other. Dong Wong and I have a conversation that lasts about 2 hours. And, I know instantly that he is great. Like, everything he's saying jives with me in terms of like what I think about writing, how I get excited about things, how nerdy I am. Like, we are simpatico in fabulous, fabulous ways. Our politics agree, like all of these things. So, I mean, I'm like, I need an agent. This guy sounds great. Comes recommended from Amo. If he'll have me, I will do this. And he did. And then I sent him the scariest of all possible contracts. And so basically like his agency used this contract as a model for like how to figure out how to work with Disney. Like they were like, all right, there's all this language. And so like it took like a team to really figure out how to negotiate that contract. And he did a great job. So the way I got my agent was basically by having a book contract first. It's not the easiest way to do it. It's just my particular path.
But when you are writing, do you find it energizing or do you find it very draining? And when you're done writing, you don't want to touch it.
That's interesting. Yeah, I find it energizing, but I'm a slow writer. So like what I do is I do cyclical kinds of writing. So the my writing day begins by editing the thing I wrote the day before, and that's the way that I'm able to get in. And so I do these loops of, going back and this kind of recursive way of doing it. So I love editing. I feel like the agony of the blank white page that Mallarmé talks about is like a real thing. Now it's like a glowing monitor that's probably bad for your eyes, worse than paper. So we even have it worse, than 18th century fin de siècle writers. But what I would say is, uh, what's energizing about writing is when it's going well, and what's not energizing about writing is when it's not going well. And I think it's not going well more often than going well, but not that much more often. Like there's still plenty of good days, but you know, you get to points where you're just like, this is not the thing that I mean to be writing. I don't have any problem stopping at that point and being like, you know what? I'm gonna try this tomorrow, because what I often find, I'm a morning writer, is that like when I approach things fresh, what was I thinking? I know how to fix this. Boom, chakalaka. I'm not fast and I'm recursive. I just I dwell on sentences and I have trouble moving on from a sentence that I don't think is right yet. And even if I'm mistaken, if I think a sentence is right, that's enough. If I go back and change it later, that's fine. But like I will stick to sentences that I don't think are musical enough yet or beautiful enough yet, not to mention, advancing plot and serving the story.
Interesting. I was going to ask about that because I know that there seem to be roughly two modes of pantser. It's either someone who's slower and kind of does a lot of what most people would consider like the outlining and the structuring like in their head as they're going, and then there's the people who just sort of vomit it all on the page and then make art out of what's there later. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, I'm
Um,
the former, definitely, not the latter. I wish I could vomit. I think the vomit would help me write faster if I could just spill and then edit, because I love editing. I think editing is easier and more joyful, and it's where all the good stuff happens.
One of the things that you've talked about, I was reading a few interviews with you, and you mentioned when you were discussing Sal and Gabi and the concept of the multiverse and of these different um, timelines or dimensions, you talked about string theory, which is initially was like a crazy thing to me to bring up in like a kid's book. And so I was curious, can you very briefly, because I know it's complicated, explain like a quick overview of what string theory is and then why you decided to explore that in Sal and Gabi?
Yeah, and so just caveat, I don't actually get into string theory in Sal and Gabby. Like to me, it was like the back reading that you do to like galvanize the metaphors and stuff. But like kids don't have to go through like a big 2-page explanation of string theory or M theory or anything like that to understand Sal and Gabby. It's very story driven in that way. But string theory is basically this idea, as you get smaller and smaller, atomic to subatomic to particle to just like the very smallest unit, that there are strings at the bottom, what physicists are calling strings, and the vibrations of those strings are the fundamental unit, and it can't get any smaller. That basically, that there is mathematics to show that you can't get any smaller than this string. Like, because people are sort of like, well, what are strings made of? Well, it's like part of the problem of the string is that, again, our language is imperfect and metaphorical, and so it doesn't precisely describe what's going on there, but you can't get any smaller than the vibration of that string. And so string theory, its job is basically to marry Einstein's theories with quantum physics, because right now they are wholly disaligned, that they function differently, and the people see quantum physics and they kind of use it in isolation, and they know Einstein's relativity, specific and general, and they use those in isolation, but how can we unify those theories? And so that's what string theory is trying to do, and it does it in ways that are completely counterintuitive to us. So for instance, one manifestation of string theory says that there are 10 dimensions only, so length or width, height, time, and then six more, and that these other dimensions are microscopic, which is another. So it's a dimension, but it's a microscopic folded dimension, in a torus like, which is a donut like shape,
Mm-hmm.
So and I mean, we can get in the weeds very, very quickly here as I try to do this, explain it like I'm five sort of version. We have brain theory, for instance, and one of the theories out there is that the Big Bang, was caused by, one universe sliding into another, and that's actually where the universes began. And that was the one that brought me back to an older theory that I don't think is current at all, which is many worlds theory, this idea that there are many worlds. But in reading someone like Brian Greene, he talks about infinity in super interesting kinds of ways, because is the universe infinite? Is the universe an infinite place, or are there different universes? And so he has this whole description of infinity that is really, really helpful to writers, because infinity isn't just like everything happens infinitely. So not only, if the universe is infinite, is there a Carlos having a conversation with you right now in this exact same way at this exact same speed, there are also all of these Carloses who might delay 1 second or might speed up a little bit, in all of these different varieties. But there are also an infinite number of Carloses who are saying things at exactly the same speed and are looking at you in exactly the same way. If you just sort of like let your mind expand out and imagine what infinity means, it can be extremely satisfyingly mind blowing. And so that kind of feeling is what I wanted to capture in the middle grade book. That's why I invent physics in there, the same way that in fantasy books we invent monsters. So the physics in my book, is calamity physics, because there is a particle that Sal's dad discovers, which he names the calamitron. And the calamitron is mostly like just like really fun to say, but it is basically the particle by which the holes and the rips and tears in the universe. Those are the ones that are released from other universes. So if you, for instance, steal a chicken, like Sal does, from another universe, you drag with it all these calamitrons, and basically the calamitrons will be the things that will eventually drag it back to its own universe.
Okay, interesting. That kind of plays into a few different things other like fiction approaches. Like I know that it's not quite the same, but in like 11/22/63, whenever the main character of Stephen King's book goes back in time to stop the John F. Kennedy assassination, uh, time fights back. Like time basically is sort of this set series of events, and if you go back and try to muck it up, time itself will be kind of like, no, 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 that's not how this happens. And so like things will happen to get in his way, like his car will break down, someone will get in his way and trip him, just these seemingly random things that inconvenience him and try to hold him up from doing the thing he's trying to do. So that's really cool.
Yeah, that's a great connection. I hadn't thought of that one.
Explore science in a really cool way, and it seems to span across like all of the works that I was doing research on like your backlog and stuff. And like in the Assimilated Cubans Guide to Quantum Santeria, there's like there were a few different stories. All of them kind of play with technology and what it means to be human. Like there's homeostasis, which was, if I remember correctly, that's the one about the man who is stabbed in the head and he gets a basically like an electrical brain upgrade, and his wife debates whether his soul still exists or whether this is now like a robot copy or a programmatic
Right,
copy. And then you've got I may not say this entirely right. Fantasy Impromptu number 4 in C sharp minor.
right.
Oh, and I don't know what OP
Opus
66.
posthumous.
Opus.
So, yeah, opus posthumous. Yeah,
And that one's about a man whose consciousness is basically put into a technologically advanced piano, and there's debate about whether his soul is present in the piano and in the music.
Right.
Um, how do you especially not just humanity, but specifically you seem to explore mortality. One of the things that I saw mentioned was that in Sal and Gabi, Sal is able to bring his mom in from other places. Is that right? Do I have that right?
His, yeah,
His
yeah. It's
mom.
like his mom. So he grabs a woman from another universe who shares her name and appearance. But, when you're talking about an infinite universe, like these people are infinitely different. And so, he wants his mom back. And he's like, oh, I'll reach into another universe and grab my mom, but it's not my mom anymore. Just think about like if you looked into a different universe and you saw yourself, you would see a someone and you would see someone who looks like you, but it wouldn't be you. The qualia of you is still inside of you. So this is one of the things that I do explore a lot. This idea of qualia, sort of like where the limits of consciousness exist and how we are testing in new ways constantly where quality stops. I think as we move into a more and more post-human era, where technology elongates life but also allows thinking itself to be preserved in ways that we never could have imagined before, that we are going to be constantly redefining what it is to be a person and what it means to be alive. And death itself, its definitions are going to change. Right now we have very specific ways that we test for death. So, for instance, one of the things that doctors do is they can test for dull eye movement. If your eyes, go back and forth, or if they don't do that anymore. But like, if your eyes have been replaced with cybernetic eyes, dull eye movement goes away, and that test goes away. And that's like a very basic example. But as more and more tests go away, and it becomes sort of like, well, what if you actually don't know when the organic part of the brain stopped working because there have been so many different cybernetic implants added to the brain that have allowed for the preservation of memory and allowed for cognitive functions to increase. And I mean, we already have different ways that we help epileptics, for instance, to function more ably in the world with technology. So we are already on the forefront of a very explosive kind of technology, the ramifications of which we just don't know the results of. Science fiction's job, I would argue, is to start thinking in advance about those ramifications and to start forming philosophies and opinions.
So there's a novella that I found online called "The Last Generation to Die." Is
Yeah.
that written by you? It
Yeah,
might be.
it totally. And so, like, The Last Generation to Die by Creative Guy Publishing. Yeah, and it's a novella. It was uh, captured in an anthology called the Amityville House of Pancakes 2. And so I have that somewhere on a shelf. But yeah, The Last Generation to Die, I think, is like one of my prototypical stories in that way. I think, it's a little bit like Juvenilia. I think the way that I would think about it now, I think if I was writing it today, I would probably cut it a lot and shrink it down. But to me, it has a surprise ending, and it's doing a lot of that same work of like what it means to be sort of like human and in control of yourself. Basically the idea is that we have found ways to extend telomeres as long as we want. So telomeres are the basically like the burning wick in every cell that tells you how many times it can split. And as soon as that wick runs down to zero, no more telomeres, that's when cells senesce. That means like no more splitting for that one. That one, when it dies, that's the end of it. And if you can figure out a way, like people are working on now, to extend telomeres, you can figure out a way to, uh, you know, possibly extend life indefinitely. So it's science fiction. So presto changeo, this is what has happened. But not everybody wants to extend their lives this way. Not everybody wants to live a life that basically is this artificial extension. And so it's a story about children and older woman named Olaria Lack, who's just uninterested in dreams of immortality, and instead much more about living inside of a moment.
And again, correct me if I'm wrong. Also, tell me if this is a spoiler because I think I read it on the Goodreads summary, so I don't think it's a spoiler. But that same woman sues the government for the right, basically, to die. Right? She's
That's right.
immortal. Awesome.
Right.
I read in an interview that originally, I think this was just before Sal and Gabi Break the Universe was going to come out. You were originally intending to take a sabbatical this summer to explore board games and tabletop role playing games. Is that how you ended up creating the role playing game that you were just mentioning?
That's exactly right. So it was a sabbatical, so it was actually longer than a summer. But the project that I proposed to my college was I want to be sure that I'm staying fresh as a writer. I want to be sure that I am not just repeating the same story and doing the same thing over and over again. We are living in a renaissance of narrative board games and role playing games right now, and I am just in love with them. I'm in love with this moment right now. Just games like Fiasco, games that are powered by the apocalypse. There are so many great games that are out right now that it was a time to explore. And the more I played them, the more I wanted to make my own. So I basically said, okay, let's think about like some of the things that I really like. And so that's when I brought my wife Claire in, and we've been collaborators, on the project really from the get go, because what we wanted to do. Claire is a trained actor. She's a voice narrator. She's been on stage many times. She is an actor, so you would expect that she would be like, "Oh yeah, role playing games. I love them. That's great. This is like right in my wheelhouse." Mm-mm. She doesn't. And one of the reasons she doesn't like them is because she likes to be rehearsed. She likes to know what she's supposed to be saying. And her encounters with role playing games have been this sort of like, okay, here are 20,000 dice. Roll them. Oh, now turn to page 67 on your character sheet. Okay, so look at Article 4, Section 9, like all of this complexity that is built into role. Now, I love role playing games. I played D&D all my life, so I love role playing games. But Claire did not. And so one of the things I wanted to do was think about, okay, so how can we whittle this down so that we just get all of the joy and none of the baggage of a role playing game that's normally that way. Something even like Powered by the Apocalypse that really just uses a couple of dice. It's much simplified from the 5e systems that are out there, was still a little heavy, but there were also, there are pure storytelling games like Once Upon a Time or whatever that weren't quite as satisfying either, because a little bit of structure goes a long way. So having some kind of marker, something like Fiasco was getting a lot closer to the kind of story that we wanted to tell. And so basically by playing a lot of games, and we played a lot by working through different things, and she loves Mysterium. So, she loved Mysterium. And so Mysterium, if you haven't played, is sort of like Clue meets Dixit. It's basically like this game where you are trying to figure out from the players are all mediums, and they are trying to communicate with the ghost to find out who killed the ghost in what location with what weapon. So that's the clue like part. But the cards are wordless and surreal and gorgeous and weird, and you can't speak as the ghost. You can only hand people cards, and what you're trying to do is get them to associate the cards with the possible murder suspects or the locations where they happen, because there might be shared images or colors or other associations. So it's a gorgeous game, but it's a purely mechanical game. You're either right or wrong. You guess the right killer or you don't. You guess the right room or you don't. And that moves you through the system. But it's so evocative that we had a birthday party for Claire where everybody invented their own mediums and dressed up, and we played in character like a role-playing game to play a game of Mysterium. From that experience, we decided, well, that's a place to start. So that's why we came up with this deck. So the role playing game that we're working on now is called Negocios Infernales. infernal negotiations. And the premise is basically like this: in a world very much like ours, that's maybe a few hundred years behind where we are right now, the most powerful nation of the world is about to go into something very equivalent and as frightening as the Spanish Inquisition. Luckily, however, they are visited by aliens, and the aliens say, you know what? We're not going to follow any prime directive nonsense. We are going to help these people avoid a pogrom that is going to wipe out people and commit all these atrocities. We're actually going to intercede. We will do it, in their own world and using their own language, however. So they appear in the court of like the Queen Isabella stand-in, and she's like, they have little dealy boppers and says,
Sure.
"Are you devils? Are you devils?" And they're like, "Yeah, sure, that'll work. Devils, yeah." And then she's like, "Will you grant us unholy powers if we give you our immortal souls?" And the alien's like, close enough. So basically, the idea is sort of like all of these wizards who have traded their souls. They haven't traded their souls, but they think they have. So there's this dramatic irony in the game. Basically, get these powers from the aliens, and they use these powers to help their kingdom. And what happens is that you create these characters using very evocative, mysterious cards of a deck that we created specifically for the game. And they're a little bit macabre, and they're a little bit ironic, and they are seeded with all sorts of sort of like grim forecasts for your future. And the games have just been hilarious and ludicrously fun. So it begins with what sounds like a fairly grim premise, but the games themselves have been hilarious and buoyant because they tend to be just improvised. And so you improvise the plot and you improvise the characters that you have, and we have a very set structure of what tells you whether you have succeeded in using your magic or if the aliens have misunderstood what you wanted, and some wild different unwanted effect has happened in the meantime. This is all to make it so that our game is basically friendly to an extreme to beginners. Basically, all you have to be able to do is draw a card and compare it to another card. If they match in suit, things go your way, and if they don't go your way. So mechanically, very light, but that is like just enough mechanic to give you a grounding to then let people's imaginations run. And it's the playtests have been so much fun.
That sounds like exactly my type of game. I love the weird the fun like improv games. You said in an interview that writing for children, the key to success is that you can't talk down to them and you can't sugarcoat the world. You have to be honest with them about the grief and the struggle that's there, and you can't talk down to them or you'll turn them off. How do you do that? How do you tell a story that explores grief without overwhelming them or making it too dark?
Yeah. So that question of too dark, I think, is a really interesting one because it assumes that there is a moment that we all know is too dark. And I think it's much more in the performance of things. And frankly, I think we're all pretty good at this. I think if you are at the point where you are writing a book for kids, like you are either interacting with kids often, or you have nieces and nephews, or you are dealing with kids. And what I often have seen in literature, especially like older kinds of literature geared for kids, is that the kids don't sound like kids at all. They don't sound like kids at all. And kids are confusing because they are still trying to figure out how to use language, and they will say things that are utterly incomprehensible and bewildering. So treating kids like they are these lockdown little adults who have their identities figured out, I think, is one of the ways that you can come across as dishonest. So one of the things that you do is when you're remembering childhood, when we're talking about, see, like when we say things clichéedly, like it's an age of discovery, we don't really think about what that means. Discovery means there are things yet to be discovered, which means there are things that you don't know yet about yourself. So one of the things I did, I told you earlier that Sal and Gabi were adults in Assimilated Cubans Guide. They were in different stories I'd never met, but I knew them as adults. I had to wind them back and think, okay, now they're kids. What kids were they before they became the adults that I already know and love so much that I want to keep writing about these characters? Well, in Gabby's case, she is absolutely convinced that she's right. And what's good about her is that she will apologize when she's wrong, but she's a person who's a debater. She's a person who like fights for points and looks for the win maybe before she looks for the truth, and because kids do that, kids who are smart and precocious often look for the win because being verbally able at a young age lends itself to that sort of thing, and you get little wins. You can make adults laugh, or you can really outmaneuver people in ways that make you feel that kind of superiority. With Sal, he's a sneak. He is what Diana Wynne Jones would have called a slitherer outerer, somebody who tries to slither out of situations, and he does it partially as a victim of the trauma of losing a mother, and that is just he becomes very protective, and having diabetes greatly influences the way in which he sort of like has to think about his body and himself. And so what he has is sort of like a series of defense mechanisms that he's built up, one of them being the performance of magic, another being his own verbal acuity, different from Gabby's because he's not looking to win arguments necessarily. He's looking for ways to make people not quite see him, or to be able to control the conversation in a way that doesn't mean winning or losing. It means more just, avert your eyes, misdirection, this sort of thing. And so the way that you do it is by staying true to the character. And in a middle grade book, every character that you're writing is yet to be the adult they're going to be. It's that is sort of like the thing to write down. Dostoevsky, when he was writing Crime and Punishment, he wrote in the margins at one point, remember, Raskolnikov is very young. And that was one of his guiding principles. He had to keep reminding himself that Raskolnikov, for whatever other attributes he wanted to ascribe to him, was a young man, not somebody who was 40 or 50 or 60 and had lived a certain kind of life. And therefore, he could engage in the kind of speculation as like, why should these people have this? We should just do it. We should, that kind of mouthing off that happens at a certain age, when you are smart and think you're capable and think you understand things, and you haven't yet been to prison and had guns pointed at you because they were making a mock execution for you, the way Dostoevsky had to go through. So that sort of thing. I think, I guess the short way to say this is sort of like really thinking about the character of the person that you're talking about. And then, Sal and Gabi Break the Universe doesn't have an explicit antagonist because the universe is the antagonist. Basically that's one of the goals I set myself. So many of the middle grade books that I read, uh, especially again, like maybe previous to a sea change that's happening that we're in the midst of now, they tend to have fairly cliched and obvious antagonists, that are obviously evil and obviously must be defeated. But that's not kids' experience, and so one of my goals was to do something a little bit different, which is let's give them all the things. Let's give them a great school with great teachers. Let's give them parents who really love them and are also smart in their own right. And then let's show them what the world is like, the losses that nobody can prevent, the diseases and disabilities that people have to deal with on a daily basis, and the the management of grief. Is definitely like one of the themes of especially the first book. The second book is a little bit different. It takes as a theme sort of like, okay, so we have people who are smart and well intentioned and on opposite sides. How do we come together to make a better universe? Like when you fix the universe, that means that we have found the way to fix the universe. And the other thing I often find happening too often in all literature, this isn't even middle grade, is that everyone's like, okay, here's what we need to do. Yes, we're all on board. Let us all fight the thing that we need to do. But in life, you don't know what to do. Like nobody knows what the hell they're doing. And so what I wanted to do is put two people in opposition to each other, both of which were wholly believable. And so this is Sal's dad and a Gabby from a different universe who's called Fix Gabby. And basically, Fix Gabby turns out to be more right than Gustavo about calamity physics. But she's become so deranged by the way that she tries to communicate this and the way that she just tries to bull her way to getting the results that she wants, that she's a danger to everybody, so she has to be kind of dismantled and brought back into the fold because she's become too maverick. And then we need to educate everybody. But luckily, Gustavo's a scientist, and so when he's proven wrong, he changes his mind. So one of the things I wanted to do is be like, these aren't forces that are fighting because people are being intransigent or difficult or snappy or witty or whatever. No, it's like as soon as you prove something, well, then you change your mind. So all of these things are like, I guess, in service of the idea of like, how do you deal with difficult topics? Well, you do them in a way that you try to represent them in ways that, of course, kids can understand, but kids can understand a lot. And then you try to be really honest to the characters.
So you're that last bit that you said there, when you're trying to represent difficult topics, it's not that the representing them in a way that kids can understand, because like you said, they can understand a lot, but in a way that makes it meaningful to them, contextualizes it to their personal experience at that time.
Exactly. And so kids know that adults aren't always right. They've seen evidence of it all their lives. But they also know that adults are right a lot of the time. And they also know that they don't have the power that adults do over their lives. So, what I wanted to do was show sort of like, here's a kid who's right, but who's out of control and who's maybe a little young to handle this information and jumps too much to conclusions to be able to actually handle the correctness that they have inside of their heads. Bring them back into the fold and work as a community to come up with better answers.
I'll finish up with two questions. One of them is, do you have any other works coming out or something that you're working on that you can talk about, as far as like books or works of fiction, things like that?
So I finished the duology. So Sal and Gabi was always written as two books, and so that's what I anticipate for now. But there will be at least one other story because Rick Riordan just announced on his tour he just finished the fifth book in the Apollo series, the Tower of Nero, and one of the things that's coming out next year is a book of stories from all of the Rick Riordan authors up to that point. And so they're all going to be, about, I'm not sure, like 8,000 to 15,000 word stories all set in their individual universes. And I will have a story in there. It's
That,
called Calamity Juice, and there will be Calamity Juice. And I hope it is worthy of the Sal and Gabi canon there. So that's coming out. And then the next thing I want to write is a one-off book. I think it's one-off. And it basically, what I'm calling it right now is Thig, Thig. And that is because rats are thigmophilic. Uh, Rats are touch loving. That's what thigmophilic means. And what I'm imagining is this: rats can communicate among themselves basically by rubbing their bodies together, and they just shoot their emotions into each other. And so they crowd together and have this massive communication that's very much like a hive mind. But they've also taken the next step. And so each rat in New York City knows exactly one word in either Spanish or English. And they also have one word that's their name that they know. So they know two words in total. And so if basically you gather, let's say, 80,000 rats, you basically have a college dictionary's worth of vocabulary available to you that you can use for conversation. And so the rats of New York have learned to speak English, and it's a good thing they did because they need the help of an exterminator family called the Matanunka family to uh, to basically help them fight against the greatest danger that they've ever encountered. They want to hire the exterminator family to defeat the dragon that has taken up residence in the sewers of New York and that is wiping out ratdom entirely.
that sounds awesome. That sounds super cool. And then,
So and the idea is just sort of like, so they're going to be like, we're going to be like in this big underground sewer surrounded by rats. And so like when the kid protagonist, is asking, well, where do we go, a rat over here will be like, we go to, so like it'll be this proscenium style conversation that we're going to have. I can't wait to write those scenes.
oh, that sounds so awesome. I'm super interested in that story. That sounds great. Um, So, and the last question I want to end on is, what is something that's making you happy recently? It can be anything, a show, it can be like an experience you've had, anything. What's something that's just brought you some joy?
Yeah, so I mean, I think joy is a battery and we need it. So we should be seeking things out and not feeling guilty for seeking things that give us joy. So I'll just name a few things. I've been watching a lot of Zoom theater online and talk about renaissances. We are having a theater renaissance right now that is merging technology in super interesting ways with theater that's happening online, especially with the use of mystery boxes or things that they will mail to you that then allow you to interact with the theater. We just here we just on November 13th and 14th, we're going to watch a Food of Love production of Twelfth Night that's going to happen on Zoom, but they're going to ship us a box. It's going to be full of tricks and treats and different things that will allow us to eat and partake of this show that they're doing. And so, like, I'm really interested in the innovations that are happening in theater. I've seen a lot of really great things happening in that regard. I am really excited about my students. So, like, I'm teaching online right now, and I was really worried about it because students who never would have taken an online class before are now being forced into an online situation. It sounds like a formula for disaster, but my students are giving me hope. They are there, and we are doing the work, and we are learning. And you know, in wearing my one of my other hats, I teach a class in interactive technology and pedagogy at the Graduate Center in CUNY, and those students there are also just sort of like helping me think about ways that I can innovate. And so I literally learned about a technology in class from one of my students that I was able to apply in this composition class that I'm teaching, and it has made all of the difference. And so I am, you know, very sorry for us collectively for this time of COVID that we have to live through. And yet, just like every other disaster, there are these burgeoning new avenues that we might not have thought of otherwise because of it. And those can lead to permanent improvements in certain kinds of ways. Like, I think I'm always going to be more hybrid now in my teaching than I ever was before because I'm learning about these different tools and these different affordances that are coming out of technology that because I was just thrown into it, I had to find them. So I'm very excited about that. I'm excited about books that are coming out. And like I said, right now we are living in a great time, not only for novels but for short fiction as well. And so, like, I am excited for Faya magazine, and I am excited about the small publishers that are putting their books out and doing so much great work for us to help writers grow into their craft and put these stories that would never find a home otherwise because they're too good. They're too weird and strange and all the things I look for. Maybe those are hard to market and might not have found a home if we didn't have presses like Erewhon, putting them out there or whatever. So I feel like there is a lot, to grieve right now in the world, but there is a lot to be joyful for as well. And find, please find joy, seek it out, let it charge you, let it rejuvenate you for the other hard work that we have to do.
That's awesome. Thank you. I really like that. I really appreciate you agreeing to sit down and talk. I'm super stoked for the big day, and I can't wait. So, but thank you very much.
This has been so great. Thank you. You've obviously did like a ton of work in preparation for this interview. So thank you for taking that care. It's really, really great. And great questions and conversation. I just couldn't be happier. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate that.